Hey guys, tonight we begin in the warm kitchens, smoky courtyards, and olive-covered hills of ancient Greece. So find a comfortable spot, maybe grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let the modern world slowly drift away. For the next while, we're traveling back more than 2,000 years to a place where philosophers debated the meaning of life, athletes competed for glory, and ordinary people worried about something much more important. What was for dinner? Ancient Greece often appears in our minds as a land of marble temples and dramatic statues staring thoughtfully into the distance. But most Greeks spent very little time discussing philosophy and considerably more time trying to avoid hunger, which honestly makes them feel much more relatable than the statues would suggest. Tonight, we are not following kings into battle or politicians into endless arguments. Instead, we are sneaking quietly into kitchens. We are opening clay jars. We are peeking into cooking pots. And we are discovering recipes that somehow survived the collapse of city-states, the rise of empires, and several thousand years of human chaos. The surprising thing is that many ancient Greek dishes would still look familiar today. In fact, some recipes have changed so little that a Greek grandmother from 21st century Athens might recognize them immediately. She would probably have opinions about your cooking, of course. Grandmothers tend to have those. Before we begin tasting our way through history, it helps to understand what the Greeks actually had available. Their world revolved around three essential ingredients: olive oil, bread, wine. If ancient Greece had a starter pack, those would be the contents. Olive trees covered hillsides across much of Greece. These trees became so valuable that they were almost family members. Unlike certain royal families we discuss on this channel, olive trees generally produced healthy offspring and caused fewer political crises. Olive oil was used for nearly everything. People cooked with it. They preserved food with it. They poured it over vegetables. Athletes rubbed themselves with it. At times, it must have seemed that every solution in Greek life involved another splash of olive oil. Bread was equally important. Most people ate some form of bread every day. Wealthier citizens enjoyed finely ground wheat bread. Poorer families often relied on barley bread, which could be dense enough to qualify as construction material under certain circumstances. Wine completed the famous trio. Greeks drank wine constantly, although usually diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered uncivilized. This may sound strange today, but every society develops its own rules for appearing respectable. One of the oldest Greek recipes, still enjoyed today, is called maza. It was essentially a barley-based dish eaten by ordinary people throughout much of Greek history. Maza could appear in many forms. Sometimes it resembled a thick porridge. Other times, it became a simple flatbread. Imagine waking up in Athens around 450 BC. The sun is barely rising. Roosters are already making unreasonable amounts of noise. And breakfast consists of barley mixed with water, olive oil, and perhaps a little honey if fortune happens to be smiling upon you. The ingredients sound simple because they were simple. Most people could not afford elaborate meals. Ancient cookbooks were not filled with 37 ingredients and instructions requiring laboratory equipment. They used what they had available and hoped for the best. Honey occupied a special place in Greek cooking. Since sugar was unknown, honey became the primary sweetener. Bees were highly valued, and honey appeared in countless dishes. If something needed sweetness, honey was the answer. Ancient Greeks were remarkably consistent on this point. One famous honey-based recipe was melituta, a type of honey cheesecake. The idea of cheesecake existing over 2,000 years ago feels strangely comforting. Some things never change. Human beings look at cheese and immediately start wondering if dessert is possible. Greek cheesecakes were often made with soft cheese, honey, and flour. The result was simple, yet surprisingly delicious. Athletes competing in early Olympic Games may even have eaten similar foods for energy, which means cheesecake possesses a stronger athletic history than many of us. Picture a baker carefully mixing cheese and honey in a small workshop near a bustling marketplace. Outside, merchants shout prices. Donkeys wander around, performing essential transportation duties, while looking deeply unimpressed by civilization as a whole. The baker shapes the mixture into cakes and places them near a hot oven. The aroma slowly fills the room. Passers-by notice. Stomachs begin making important observations. Business improves accordingly. Another recipe that survived the centuries is lentil soup. Ancient Greeks loved lentils. Philosophers discussed them. Farmers grew them. Families cooked them endlessly. Lentils were affordable, nutritious, and widely available. In other words, they possessed all the qualities needed for culinary success. A pot of lentil soup might simmer for hours over a small fire. Lentils softened gradually. Onions added flavor. Olive oil contributed richness. Herbs brought fragrance. Nothing fancy happened. No dramatic cooking techniques emerged. Just patient simmering and practical nourishment. The philosopher Socrates likely encountered lentil soup many times during his life. Of course, Socrates had opinions about nearly everything. One suspects he could transform an innocent bowl of soup into a complicated discussion about virtue and knowledge within minutes. Ancient cooks also prepared various vegetable dishes. Cabbage appeared frequently. So did onions, leeks, and garlic. These vegetables were not glamorous. Nobody wrote epic poems celebrating the emotional journey of a turnip. Yet they kept people alive. Garlic deserves special mention because Greeks adored it. Athletes ate garlic before competitions. Soldiers consumed garlic before campaigns. Ordinary citizens enjoyed garlic regularly. Entire cities may have smelled like garlic from time to time. Historical accuracy occasionally comes with unexpected side effects. Fish occupied another important place in Greek cuisine. Coastal communities had easy access to seafood. Fresh fish appeared in markets daily. Wealthy citizens often purchased expensive varieties, while ordinary families settled for whatever fit their budgets. One simple fish recipe involved grilling freshly caught fish and seasoning it with olive oil, herbs, and salt. That was essentially the entire process. Sometimes the best recipes are surprisingly straightforward. Ancient Greeks understood this long before food influencers arrived to explain it. Imagine standing beside the Aegean Sea as fishermen return with their catches. Nets drip seawater, gulls circle overhead, merchants negotiate prices. Somewhere nearby, someone is already preparing dinner, using methods that would remain familiar thousands of years later. Perhaps the most famous Greek flavor combination involved honey and nuts. Walnuts appeared frequently in desserts and snacks. Combined with honey, they created a rich sweetness that remains popular throughout the Mediterranean today. A guest attending a Greek symposium might find bowls of nuts waiting on low tables. Wine flowed gently. Conversations drifted between politics, philosophy, and gossip. Human beings have always enjoyed discussing other people's problems while eating snacks. Interestingly, many Greek recipes emphasized balance rather than excess. Meals often remained modest. Portions were reasonable. Ingredients were fresh. Nobody attempted to create a 20-layer dessert capable of causing immediate existential regret. This moderation partly reflected necessity. Resources were limited. Transport was difficult. Food had to make sense economically. Yet the result was a cuisine that often appears surprisingly modern when viewed today. As evening settles across an ancient village, families gather around simple meals. Bread rests on wooden tables. Olive oil glistens in clay dishes. Lentil soup steams gently in bowls. Conversations unfold slowly beneath fading sunlight. Nobody knows that historians, thousands of years later, will study these meals. Nobody suspects that recipes will survive the rise and fall of empires. They are simply eating dinner. Yet, through those ordinary meals, a small part of their world quietly endures. And as our first evening in ancient Greece comes to a close, we can already see a pattern emerging. The greatest Greek recipes were rarely complicated. They relied on patience, fresh ingredients, and traditions passed carefully from one generation to the next. So let the fire burn low, let the marketplace grow quiet, and let us continue our slow culinary journey through the ancient Mediterranean in the next part, where even more surprisingly familiar recipes are waiting just beyond the olive groves. As we slowly return to the kitchens of ancient Greece, the smell of warm bread and olive oil still hangs in the air. The streets are quieter now, and somewhere inside a small home, another simple meal is being prepared with ingredients that have survived thousands of years. One dish that deserves attention is kykeon, a strange but fascinating Greek drink. It was made by mixing water, barley, and sometimes herbs or honey. It sounds simple, and honestly, it was. Ancient Greeks were not trying to create complicated cafe beverages with 17 unnecessary ingredients. Kykeon was especially connected with rural life and religious traditions. Some people consumed it during rituals, while others simply enjoyed it as a practical drink. It was nutritious, filling, and easy to prepare, which are usually the qualities people appreciate when they are not trying to impress food critics. Barley was extremely important in Greek society. While wheat was considered superior, barley was reliable and grew well in difficult conditions. It was the dependable friend of ancient agriculture, not glamorous, but always there when everyone else needed help. Greek farmers understood seasonal eating very well. They did not have supermarkets filled with endless choices. Instead, they worked with what nature provided: olives in one season, grapes in another, vegetables when available, and preserved foods when winter arrived. One popular method of preservation was drying. Fruits, especially figs, were dried and stored for later use. Dried figs became a valuable food source because they lasted longer and provided sweetness during colder months. Ancient Greeks basically created their own natural energy snacks. Figs were so important that they became connected with trade and wealth. Certain regions became famous for producing excellent figs. Naturally, humans did what humans always do. They created rules, arguments, and even political discussions about them. Another common ingredient was cheese. Greek cheese-making traditions were already highly developed. Sheep and goat milk were especially valuable because these animals adapted well to the mountainous landscape of Greece. The most famous ancient Greek cheese was similar to what we now know as feta. It was salty, preserved, and perfect for storing. Ancient people understood something important. Food that survives longer is usually food worth making. Greek meals often included a combination of flavors rather than one dominant taste. Salty cheese, sweet honey, bitter herbs, and rich olive oil created a balance that remains popular in Mediterranean cooking today. Herbs played a major role in Greek cuisine. Oregano, thyme, mint, and coriander were commonly used. These plants were not only valued for flavor, but also for their believed health benefits. Ancient Greeks loved the idea that food could support the body. This belief connected cooking and medicine. Of course, some theories were accurate, while others were wonderfully imaginative. The famous physician Hippocrates wrote about diet and health, believing that food choices influenced physical well-being. He may not have had modern science, but he understood one timeless truth. What people eat matters. Let's float over to another ancient kitchen scene. A family gathers around a wooden table. There is no fancy decoration, no complicated presentation, just food prepared carefully after a long day of work. A bowl of vegetables sits beside bread and cheese. Someone pours olive oil over the meal. Children wait impatiently because apparently children have been impatient since the beginning of human civilization. One interesting Greek recipe was called plakos, an early form of flat cake. It combined ingredients like cheese, honey, and flour. It was enjoyed as a sweet treat and shows that humans have always found ways to make cheese feel like dessert. Ancient Greek cooks also prepared various pies. These were not exactly like modern pies, but they used layers of dough filled with different ingredients. Sometimes cheese was included, sometimes vegetables, and occasionally sweet fillings. Cooking in ancient Greece was not only about survival. Food represented hospitality, family, and social connection. Sharing a meal was a way to strengthen relationships and show respect to guests. The Greeks had a strong tradition of welcoming visitors. A guest arriving at a home would often receive food and drink before any serious conversation began. Ancient hospitality rules were strict because apparently ignoring hungry visitors was considered bad manners. Of course, wealthy Greeks experienced food differently from ordinary farmers. Rich households had more variety, more servants, and more elaborate meals. Poor families relied on simpler dishes that were equally important to their survival. This difference reminds us that ancient societies were never one single experience. A wealthy citizen in Athens and a farmer in a small village lived completely different lives, even though they shared many of the same foods. And that is what makes ancient recipes so fascinating. They reveal not just what people ate, but how they lived, worked, celebrated, and survived through changing times. So as the evening settles over ancient Greece, we leave this kitchen behind for now. But the journey is far from finished. More forgotten recipes, strange traditions, and surprisingly modern dishes are waiting quietly in the next part. As we continue wandering through the ancient Greek world, let's leave the grand temples behind and step into ordinary homes. Because the real story of food was never only about kings and philosophers. It was about families preparing simple meals after long days of farming, trading, and surviving. The average Greek household did not have endless choices. There were no giant markets filled with foods from every corner of the world. People depended on local ingredients, seasonal harvests, and recipes passed down quietly from parents to children. One of the most common foods was bread. It appeared at almost every meal and came in many forms. Wheat bread was preferred by wealthier families, while barley bread was more common among ordinary citizens because it was cheaper and easier to produce. Ancient Greek bakers were highly skilled. They created different shapes and textures of bread, sometimes adding seeds, herbs, or sweet ingredients. A simple loaf might seem ordinary today, but thousands of years ago, bread represented comfort, stability, and survival. Another important food was the humble olive. For Greeks, olives were not just a snack, they were a symbol of life itself. Olive trees grew slowly, survived harsh conditions, and provided food, oil, and even materials for daily life. A Greek farmer might spend years caring for an olive tree before seeing its full production. It was a relationship requiring patience. Luckily, olive trees were less dramatic than royal families and rarely caused inheritance disputes. Olive oil became one of the most valuable ingredients in Greek cooking. It was used for frying, dressing vegetables, preserving foods, and adding flavor. A small amount could transform a basic meal into something much more enjoyable. Vegetables were another important part of Greek diets. People consumed onions, garlic, cabbage, beans, and various greens. These foods were usually prepared simply because the goal was nourishment, rather than creating complicated culinary performances. Legumes, especially beans and lentils, were essential for many households. They were affordable, filling, and provided much-needed nutrition. A warm bowl of lentil soup could feed an entire family, which made it a reliable favorite across generations. Ancient Greeks also enjoyed seafood, especially in coastal regions. Fishing communities relied heavily on the sea, bringing back everything from small fish to larger catches. Fresh seafood was often grilled and served with herbs, salt, and olive oil. Of course, not everyone had access to expensive fish. Wealthy citizens could enjoy premium seafood, while poorer families ate smaller varieties. Ancient food, like modern food, often reflected social differences. Meat was less common in everyday meals. Animals were valuable, and raising livestock required resources. Meat was usually associated with festivals, religious ceremonies, and special occasions rather than normal daily eating. When meat was available, Greeks enjoyed lamb, goat, and pork. These dishes were often prepared during celebrations where entire communities gathered together. Ancient people understood something we still understand today. Food somehow becomes better when shared. Greek desserts were usually simple but satisfying. Honey played a major role because sugar was unavailable. Cakes, pastries, and sweetbreads were often flavored with honey, nuts, and dried fruits. One popular sweet ingredient was sesame. Greeks mixed sesame seeds with honey to create treats that provided energy and sweetness. It was basically an ancient version of a protein bar, except nobody was selling it with dramatic fitness music. Meals were often accompanied by conversation. Greeks valued social eating especially during gatherings called symposia. These events involved drinking, discussions, music, and sometimes people confidently explaining ideas nobody asked about. The symposium was mainly associated with men from elite classes, but it reveals something important about Greek culture. Food was not just fuel, it was connected to identity, relationships, and social traditions. Women also played a central role in preparing and managing food inside households. While many historical records focused on male activities, everyday cooking depended heavily on women's knowledge and organization. A household cook needed to understand storage, preservation, preparation, and seasonal availability. These skills were incredibly valuable, even if ancient writers rarely celebrated them. And that is one of history's quiet patterns. The people who kept daily life running were often the people whose names disappeared. Their work was essential, but their stories were rarely written down. So tonight, as we leave another ancient Greek kitchen behind, we remember that every recipe carries a hidden story. Behind every loaf of bread and every bowl of soup were real people living ordinary lives. And in the next part, we will continue deeper into Greek culinary traditions, exploring forgotten dishes, festival foods, and recipes that surprisingly still appear on tables today. As we continue our slow journey through ancient Greece, let's move away from everyday meals and step into the world of celebrations, because even ancient people understood one important truth. Ordinary food keeps you alive, but special food creates memories. Greek festivals often involved large gatherings where communities came together to eat, drink, and honor their gods. These events were not just religious ceremonies. They were also opportunities for neighbors, families, and friends to share meals. One of the most important celebrations was the Panathenaic festival in Athens. Thousands of people gathered, and food played a major role. Large sacrifices provided meat for public meals, allowing many citizens to enjoy dishes they might rarely experience. Of course, ancient festivals were not exactly casual backyard dinners. There were traditions, rules, and plenty of social expectations. Greeks loved organization almost as much as they loved discussing philosophy. During these celebrations, roasted meat was often prepared over open fires. The smell of cooking would spread through the streets, attracting attention from anyone nearby. Ancient Greece probably had its own version of people following their noses toward delicious food. Sacrificial meals were an important part of Greek religious life. Animals were offered to the gods, and portions were distributed among participants. The meal became a connection between humans, communities, and their beliefs. Another interesting Greek dish was called mima. This was a mixture of chopped ingredients, often including meat, herbs, and spices. It was a flavorful dish that showed Greek cooks understood the importance of combining different tastes. Ancient Greek cuisine also included various sauces. One famous example was gyros, a fermented fish sauce that added salty flavor to meals. It was similar to sauces used in other Mediterranean cultures and was surprisingly popular. At first, fermented fish sauce may sound unusual, but humans have always been creative when trying to preserve and improve food. Ancient Greeks simply discovered that thyme and salt could create something useful. Honey continued to appear in many special dishes. Greeks used it in cakes, drinks, and sweet preparations. Without modern sugar, honey was one of the easiest ways to add sweetness to food. A famous Greek dessert was amphiphon, a type of cake connected with religious celebrations. It included ingredients like honey and cheese, showing once again that ancient Greeks were perfectly willing to put cheese into almost anything. Let's float over to the island communities of Greece, where seafood shaped daily cooking traditions. Life near the sea meant access to fish, shellfish, and other marine foods that became central parts of local diets. Fishermen often prepared their catches immediately after returning from the water. Fresh fish could be grilled simply with olive oil and herbs. Sometimes the best recipe is the one that allows the original ingredient to speak for itself. Greek islands also produced excellent herbs and fruits. The warm climate supported grapes, figs, olives, and aromatic plants. These ingredients created flavors that still define Mediterranean cooking today. Wine production was another major part of Greek culture. Vineyards covered many landscapes, and wine appeared in both ordinary meals and important gatherings. Greeks even developed specific traditions around drinking, because apparently even beverages needed proper social rules. Wine was usually mixed with water before drinking. Consuming strong, undiluted wine was considered excessive. The Greeks believed moderation showed civilization, although their debates during drinking parties were sometimes anything but moderate. Ancient Greek cooks also valued leftovers. Food was rarely wasted because ingredients required time, effort, and resources. Leftover bread could become another dish, and extra vegetables could be transformed into new meals. This practical attitude feels surprisingly modern. Today, many people search for ways to reduce food waste, while ancient households were already doing it because survival demanded creativity. One simple recipe that still resembles modern dishes is Greek salad. Ancient Greeks did not have the exact modern version with tomatoes, since tomatoes arrived much later, but combinations of vegetables, cheese, olives, and olive oil were common. The foundation of Greek cooking was always simplicity. Fresh ingredients, careful preparation, and balance mattered more than complicated techniques. A meal did not need dozens of components to feel complete, and perhaps that is why these recipes survived. They were not created for royal kitchens alone. They belonged to ordinary people who cooked because they had to, shared because they wanted to, and passed traditions forward. So, as the evening grows quieter, we leave another ancient Greek feast behind. But the journey through their kitchens is still continuing. More forgotten recipes, surprising ingredients, and timeless cooking traditions are waiting in the next part. And so, as our quiet journey through the kitchens of ancient Greece comes to an end, we leave behind more than just old recipes. We discover a connection between the past and the present, where simple ingredients like olive oil, bread, honey, cheese, and herbs still tell stories that began thousands of years ago. The Greeks did not cook with endless choices or modern tools, but they created meals built on patience, balance, and tradition. Behind every ancient dish was a farmer, a baker, a family, and a community simply trying to live, share, and enjoy the small moments of life. Perhaps that is why these recipes survived for so long. not because they were complicated, but because they were human. So as the ancient fires slowly fade and the Greek villages become quiet under the night sky, we can rest knowing that every meal carries a piece of history, waiting patiently to be remembered. Long before smartphones, sponsored posts, and people explaining their morning routines to millions of strangers, ancient Rome already understood one important truth. Attention was power. The Romans did not have social media, but they had statues, gossip networks, public speeches, luxury displays, and a surprising obsession with personal branding. Roman elites were not simply trying to live well, they were performing a carefully designed version of themselves. For everyone around them, a wealthy senator was not just rich, he was supposed to look wise, generous, powerful, and occasionally humble, which was naturally very convenient when everyone knew he was extremely wealthy. The Roman world was filled with people competing for reputation. Families collected famous ancestors like modern people collect followers. Having a respected name mattered because Roman society treated image almost like currency. A person could lose political influence simply because people stopped believing the story they created about themselves. One of the earliest masters of Roman personal branding was Julius Caesar. He understood something that many modern influencers understand today. The story matters almost as much as the person. Caesar carefully controlled how Romans saw him, presenting himself as a brilliant commander and a man destined for greatness. Of course, Caesar was not walking around with a ring light and a camera crew. His version of content creation involved writers, public announcements, coins, and carefully prepared speeches. Because why not turn military victories into a full promotional campaign when you already have an army and a dramatic personality? Caesar's famous writings about his own military campaigns were not simple diaries. They were polished political tools. He described his victories, his leadership, and his ability to overcome challenges. The result was basically an ancient version of saying, "Here is my amazing journey. Please admire my achievements." The interesting part was that Romans understood this was happening. They were not completely fooled. Ancient people were perfectly capable of recognizing propaganda. They simply enjoyed it anyway. Much like people today can watch a glamorous lifestyle video while knowing every detail has been carefully arranged. Roman leaders used coins as tiny portable advertisements. Every time someone paid for bread, wine, or a service, they might see the face of an emperor staring back at them. Imagine buying groceries and finding a celebrity's face printed on every coin you touched. Rome had branding before branding had a name. Emperors especially loved controlling their public image. Their portraits appeared across the empire, showing carefully chosen hairstyles, expressions, and clothing. Some looked serious and wise, others looked youthful and heroic. Reality was less important than the message being sent. The Emperor Augustus became one of history's greatest image managers. After years of civil conflict, he wanted Romans to see him as a peaceful restorer, not merely the winner of a brutal political struggle. So he created an image of stability, tradition, and calm leadership. Augustus was basically saying, "Everything is normal now. Please ignore the complicated events that brought me here." And remarkably, this worked. Rome entered a long period of relative peace, while Augustus quietly built a system where his personal reputation became connected with the entire future of the empire. Roman influencers were not only politicians. Wealthy citizens also competed through fashion, architecture, parties, and public generosity. A powerful Roman might sponsor games, build temples, or provide food for citizens. These actions created a reputation that followed them everywhere. Public generosity had a practical side. A wealthy person who paid for a festival was not just being kind. They were reminding everyone who had money, influence, and connections. It was a very expensive way of saying, "Remember me." Ancient advertising could be incredibly dramatic. The Roman elite also loved luxury displays, expensive fabrics, imported foods, decorated homes, and rare objects all communicated status. A dinner party was not simply a meal. It was a carefully designed performance where guests observed the host's wealth and taste. Some Roman banquets became legendary because they were almost competitions in extravagance. Guests were surrounded by exotic dishes, entertainment, and impressive decorations. The message was simple. This person has enough resources to create an experience you cannot easily forget. Of course, Romans also complained about these displays. They criticized excessive luxury while continuing to enjoy being invited to luxurious events. Humanity had apparently perfected the art of judging something while secretly hoping to receive an invitation. Another major part of Roman influence culture was gossip. Romans loved discussing the private lives of famous people, political figures, wealthy families, and emperors were constantly watched, criticized, and analyzed. In many ways, ancient Rome had its own version of celebrity gossip channels. Writers like Suetonius recorded strange habits, rumors, and scandals about emperors. Some stories were exaggerated, some were probably political attacks, and some were simply entertaining. Romans understood that unusual behavior made famous people more memorable. The Emperor Nero became one of Rome's most famous examples of a ruler obsessed with performance. He enjoyed music, poetry, and acting, which was unusual for someone expected to focus on ruling an empire. Roman elites were not always impressed by his artistic dreams. To many Romans, an emperor performing on stage felt strange because traditional Roman values emphasized military strength and seriousness. Nero, however, wanted admiration for his talents. He wanted applause. He wanted recognition. Essentially, he wanted the ancient equivalent of a massive fan club. The funny contradiction was that Roman society valued fame, but often criticized people who openly chased it. Everyone wanted influence, but nobody wanted to appear desperate for attention. The Romans had already discovered the complicated relationship between popularity and embarrassment. And this is where ancient Rome starts looking strangely familiar. The technology changed, the clothing changed, and thankfully, the hairstyles became somewhat easier to manage. But the human desire remained the same. People wanted to be noticed, remembered, admired, and occasionally envied. As we slowly wander deeper into Roman history, we find more emperors, celebrities, and powerful families who understood the strange art of becoming unforgettable. Some mastered it beautifully, others created disasters so memorable that history kept talking about them for thousands of years. Roman society did not have movie stars, but it had something very similar: gladiators, poets, politicians, and wealthy social figures became famous beyond their own neighborhoods. Their names carried reputation, admiration, criticism, and sometimes ridiculous amounts of attention. Gladiators were among the most recognizable celebrities in ancient Rome. These fighters were technically enslaved people, prisoners or volunteers seeking fortune, but some became incredibly famous. Their faces appeared on paintings, lamps, cups, and souvenirs, because apparently ancient Romans also enjoyed collecting merchandise connected to famous personalities. A successful gladiator could become a symbol of strength and courage. Crowds remembered their fighting style, personality, and victories. Some even gained wealthy admirers who supported them. The Roman public loved the combination of danger, drama, and personal stories surrounding these arena figures. One famous gladiator was Spartacus, whose story became legendary. Although his rebellion was ultimately defeated, his name survived because Romans and later generations found his life impossible to ignore. A person does not need a perfect ending to become famous. Roman poets also became influencers in their own way. Writers like Ovid built personal reputations through their works, style, and public image. Poetry was not just entertainment, it was a way to gain attention among educated Romans who valued intelligence and creativity. Ovid became famous for writing about love, relationships, and human emotions. His style was witty and playful, which made him popular. However, his success also created problems because powerful people were not always comfortable with artists who attracted too much attention. The Roman world was full of carefully managed reputations. A poet needed patrons, a politician needed supporters, and a wealthy citizen needed public approval. Everyone was constantly building a personal brand, even if they never used those words. Roman women from elite families also participated in this world of influence. Although their official political roles were limited, powerful women shaped public opinion through family connections, wealth, charity, and social networks. Women like Livia Drusilla became important figures behind the scenes. Livia created an image of dignity, loyalty, and traditional Roman values. She was presented as the ideal Roman woman, calm and respectable, while quietly holding significant influence. Of course, ancient politics was rarely as peaceful as portraits suggested. Behind elegant clothing and polite conversations were complicated relationships, family strategies, and endless competition. Rome was full of people smiling in public while calculating their next move privately. The Roman obsession with appearance also extended to physical features. Wealthy Romans cared about clothing, hairstyles, and personal presentation. A person's appearance could communicate their social position before they even spoke a single word. Roman hairstyles became a form of identity. Emperors introduced new styles, and citizens sometimes copied them. A haircut could become a political statement. Imagine changing your hairstyle because the emperor did it, and suddenly everyone knows exactly which leader you admire. Statues were another powerful tool of Roman influence. These were not simple decorations. They were carefully designed images meant to preserve someone's memory. A statue could show wisdom, military ability, beauty, or authority, depending on how it was created. Many Roman portraits were idealized. An emperor might be shown younger, stronger, and more impressive than reality, because honestly, nobody wants a statue that says, Here stands a tired man who has not slept properly in 20 years. Public monuments worked like ancient social media posts carved into stone. Buildings, arches, and inscriptions reminded citizens of achievements. Every structure carried a message about who built it and why people should remember them. The Roman elite understood that controlling memory was extremely important. A person who controlled their public image could influence how future generations viewed them. In a world without photographs or videos, monuments became permanent advertisements. Even ordinary Romans participated in smaller forms of self-promotion. They decorated homes with artwork showing their values, achievements, and connections. A house was not just a place to live. It was a statement about the person who owned it. The Romans were also fascinated by rumors about famous people. Private behavior became public entertainment. The lives of emperors and wealthy families were constantly discussed, creating an environment where reputation could rise or collapse quickly. Some historical figures became famous because they carefully created their image. Others became famous because they accidentally created chaos. Either way, Rome proved that attention itself was a powerful force. The ancient Roman influencer was not selling skincare products or travel packages. They were selling something more valuable: status, reputation, and the idea that their life mattered. Thousands of years later, the tools changed, but the desire remained almost exactly the same. And as we drift further through Roman history, we begin to meet the emperors who took personal branding to strange new levels. Some wanted to appear like gods. Some wanted to be loved like celebrities. Some simply wanted everyone to stop criticizing them for 5 minutes. Roman emperors understood one simple idea better than almost anyone else. Power was not only about controlling armies, it was also about controlling the story people told about you. A successful emperor needed victories, respect, and a carefully polished image that reached every corner of the empire. The first emperors created a tradition where leadership became a performance. They appeared on coins, monuments, and official artwork. Every image had a purpose. A serious face suggested wisdom. A military outfit suggested strength. A calm expression suggested that everything was completely under control. Of course, things were not always completely under control. Behind those marble statues were ordinary humans dealing with stress, family problems, personal insecurities, and the endless pressure of ruling millions of people. The empire looked organized from the outside, but inside, it was often a complicated family drama, wearing expensive clothing. Caligula became one of the most famous examples of an emperor whose image became larger than life. Ancient writers described him as unpredictable and obsessed with his own importance. Some stories may have been exaggerated because Roman historians enjoyed making powerful people look ridiculous. Caligula's reputation survived because Romans loved stories about unusual rulers. Whether every rumor was true or not, the image remained. An emperor who treated power almost like a personal entertainment project. He became remembered less as a normal administrator and more as a symbol of extreme behavior. The interesting thing about Caligula is that he understood attention. He knew that dramatic actions made people talk about him in a strange way. He mastered the ancient version of becoming impossible to ignore, even if the attention was negative. Negative attention was still attention in Rome. A scandal could damage someone's reputation, but it could also make them unforgettable. The Romans understood something that modern celebrities also know. Being discussed by everyone is sometimes considered better than being forgotten. Then came Nero, who had a very different approach to fame. Nero wanted admiration for his artistic talents. He loved poetry, music, and performance, and he wanted people to appreciate him as a creative genius. Many Roman elites were uncomfortable with this. In their eyes, emperors were supposed to command armies and protect traditions, not seek applause like performers. Nero, however, enjoyed the spotlight. He wanted recognition from audiences, and he wanted his talents celebrated. His artistic ambitions created a strange contrast. He ruled one of history's largest empires, yet he also cared deeply about winning artistic competitions. Imagine managing international politics while worrying about whether the judges appreciated your singing. Ancient Rome could be surprisingly dramatic. Nero's public image was carefully connected to entertainment. He organized performances and appearances where people could see his talents. Supporters praised him, while critics questioned whether an emperor should spend so much time seeking personal admiration. The Roman idea of celebrity often mixed admiration with suspicion. People loved famous individuals, but also enjoyed watching them fail. The higher someone climbed, the more entertaining their downfall became. This pattern continued with later emperors. Some created images of wisdom and discipline, others preferred luxury and personal pleasure. Each ruler became a different kind of public figure, almost like different styles of celebrity. Hadrian created an image of the intellectual emperor. He was interested in architecture, philosophy, and travel. Instead of presenting himself only as a warrior, he wanted to appear educated and cultured. Hadrian traveled extensively across the empire, visiting provinces and inspecting projects. These journeys helped strengthen his connection with distant citizens. In a modern comparison, it was almost like a ruler constantly appearing in different locations to remind everyone that he was present. His famous building projects also strengthened his image. The structures connected his name with greatness and ambition. Buildings became his version of a permanent advertisement, lasting long after ordinary speeches disappeared. However, even successful image management had limits. An emperor could create a powerful public identity, but personal relationships and private decisions still shaped how people remembered him. Roman rulers spent enormous effort creating the perfect public image. They carefully selected symbols, clothing, titles, and stories. They understood that leadership was partly about reality, but also about perception. The fascinating part is that ordinary Romans participated in this system too. They admired emperors, copied fashions, discussed rumors, and followed the personalities of powerful figures. The empire was not just governed by politics, it was also influenced by attention. As we continue wandering through ancient Rome, we find that influence was not limited to emperors and politicians. Even wealthy families, entertainers, and social figures discovered ways to become famous. Rome was already building a world where being noticed could become its own kind of power. The story of ancient Rome's influencers finally brings us back to one simple idea. People have always wanted to be seen, remembered, and admired. The Romans built statues instead of profiles, wrote poems instead of posts, and carved messages into stone instead of uploading them online. Their world had emperors chasing applause, wealthy families showing off luxury, and celebrities whose names traveled across the empire. The tools have changed, but the human desire behind them has remained almost exactly the same. Ancient Rome did not invent modern influencers, but it understood the powerful art of attention long before the internet existed, and perhaps that is the most Roman thing of all, turning even ordinary human ambition into a grand performance that could last for thousands of years. Medieval life was not a constant nightmare, but it was a world where almost everything required effort, from waking up in a cold stone house to finding enough food for winter. Ordinary people lived with problems that modern people usually avoid. Comfort was rare, and inconvenience was basically a daily companion. For most medieval villagers, life began with the rising sun. There were no alarms, no coffee machines, and no comfortable morning routines. Instead, there was work waiting outside. Fields needed attention, animals needed care, and families depended on everyone doing their part. The average person in medieval Europe spent most of their life connected to survival, growing crops, repairing tools, collecting firewood, and preparing food were not hobbies. They were necessary tasks. Missing one important season could create problems that lasted for months. Food was one of the biggest sources of stress. People did not simply walk into a supermarket and choose from endless options. They depended on harvests, weather, and luck. A poor harvest could mean smaller meals, rising prices, and anxious communities wondering how they would survive the colder months. The medieval diet was often repetitive. Bread, grains, vegetables, and simple soups were common. Meat existed, but many ordinary people did not eat it regularly. The wealthy could enjoy elaborate meals, while peasants often had to make simple ingredients last as long as possible. Medieval nobles had their own strange collection of worries. They had more comfort, but they also lived under constant pressure. A noble family needed land, alliances, heirs, and political connections. One bad decision could damage generations of carefully built reputation. Marriage among medieval elites was rarely just about romance. It was usually a political arrangement. Families looked for wealth, territory, and useful connections. Two people could be placed together because their families wanted an advantage, which was basically medieval networking with expensive clothing. Royal marriages were especially complicated. A prince or princess was not simply choosing a partner, they were becoming part of a diplomatic strategy. Their personal feelings often came second to treaties, inheritance, and the endless royal obsession with producing heirs. Having children was extremely important for noble families. A ruler without an heir created uncertainty. Entire kingdoms could become unstable because one person failed to provide a successor. The pressure was enormous, especially when medieval medicine offered very limited help. Childhood itself was not an easy experience. Medieval children from wealthy families might receive education and training, but they were still expected to enter adult responsibilities early. Young nobles learned politics, religion, and military skills, while ordinary children learned practical work from their families. Let's float over to another medieval problem: health. The human body in the Middle Ages had to deal with many challenges. Illnesses that are easily treated today could become serious problems because people lacked modern medicine, antibiotics, and scientific understanding. Medieval doctors were not simply foolish people. Many tried their best. With the knowledge available at the time, they studied ancient texts, observed symptoms, and developed treatments. Unfortunately, sometimes their solutions were based on ideas that were confidently wrong. The famous theory of balancing bodily fluids shaped medieval medicine for centuries. Doctors believed health depended on keeping certain substances in balance. The explanation sounded logical at the time, even if the actual science was, unfortunately, having a very difficult day. Dental problems were another common issue. People experienced tooth pain without modern dentists or comfortable treatments. A painful tooth could become a major distraction in daily life. Imagine trying to work in a field while your mouth constantly reminds you that something is wrong. Medieval cities created different challenges. They were centers of trade, but they were also crowded places with limited sanitation. Narrow streets, animals, waste, and busy markets created environments that were not exactly designed with comfort in mind. Even wealthy people dealt with unpleasant realities. Castles looked impressive from the outside, but inside they could be cold, dark, and uncomfortable. Thick stone walls were excellent for defense, but not particularly friendly when winter arrived. A medieval castle was not the cozy fantasy image people sometimes imagine. Rooms could be smoky, lighting was limited, and privacy was rare. Royal families lived with servants constantly nearby, meaning even powerful people had very little personal space. Sleep was another challenge. Beds were valuable possessions, especially among the wealthy. Ordinary people often slept on simple materials, like straw or basic bedding. A comfortable night of rest was not guaranteed, and waking up with aches was probably a common experience. Travel was also stressful. Roads were often rough, transportation was slow, and journeys required preparation. A trip that takes a few hours today could take days or weeks in medieval times. People had to accept that distance was a serious obstacle. Weather controlled almost every part of medieval life. Rain, drought, harsh winters, and unexpected storms could influence food supplies and economic conditions. People watched the skies carefully because nature was not just scenery, it was a powerful force controlling their future. And while ordinary people worried about survival, kings and queens worried about something different, keeping their power. Medieval rulers lived surrounded by advisors, rivals, family expectations, and the constant need to appear strong, even when life behind the crown was far less comfortable. For medieval farmers, every year followed a familiar cycle of hope and worry. Planting crops brought the hope of a good harvest, but there was always uncertainty. Too much rain, too little rain, or a sudden problem could turn months of hard work into disappointment. The farming calendar controlled people's lives. Spring meant planting. Summer meant maintaining crops. Autumn meant harvesting. And winter meant surviving. There was very little time when people could simply relax. Even celebrations were often connected to agricultural seasons. Tools were another source of stress. A broken plow or damaged equipment could create serious problems. Modern people replace broken items easily, but medieval workers often had to repair what they owned because every object required valuable time and resources. Clothing also required effort. Most medieval people did not have large collections of outfits waiting in a wardrobe. Clothes were expensive, repaired repeatedly, and passed between family members. A simple garment represented hours of work, from growing materials to creating the final piece. For wealthy nobles, fashion was another form of competition. Clothing showed status, wealth, and importance. Expensive fabrics and decorative designs helped announce social position. Basically, medieval society had its own version of showing off, except the expensive jacket could take months to create. Hygiene was another complicated part of medieval life. People did care about cleanliness, despite popular myths. However, they lacked modern plumbing and convenient facilities. Bathing, washing clothes, and maintaining personal care required more effort than simply turning a tap. Medieval homes were often shared spaces. Families, animals, tools, and food supplies could exist close together. Privacy was limited, and personal space was a luxury. A quiet room alone was something most medieval people rarely experienced. Children grew up surrounded by adult responsibilities. From a young age, they learned skills needed for survival. A child might help with farming, household tasks, or family businesses. Childhood existed, but it looked very different from the protected childhood many people know today. Education depended heavily on social class. Noble children might learn reading, writing, languages, and courtly behavior. Many ordinary children learned through observation and practice. Rather than formal schooling, their classroom was everyday life itself. Religion also shaped medieval thinking. Churches influenced daily routines, festivals, moral ideas, and explanations about the world. Faith provided comfort and community, but it also created expectations about behavior and responsibility. Medieval people lived with a strong awareness of their place in society. Social roles were clearly defined. A farmer, craftsman, noble, or religious figure had different duties. Changing one's position was possible, but usually difficult. Let's drift over to the world of medieval workers, where stress came in many different forms. Craftsmen spent years learning their trades, often beginning as apprentices who worked under experienced masters. A blacksmith, for example, needed skill, strength, and patience. Creating tools and weapons required knowledge passed down through generations. A mistake could waste valuable materials, so the pressure to perform was always present. Merchants faced their own challenges. Trade could bring wealth, but travel, uncertain markets, and political problems created risks. A successful merchant needed knowledge, connections, and a little luck. Medieval business was basically negotiation, mixed with hoping everything went according to plan. Life in medieval towns could be exciting, but it was also crowded and demanding. Markets brought opportunities, yet cities had problems with noise, limited space, and competition. Everyone was trying to earn enough money while dealing with the challenges around them. The wealthy sometimes escaped ordinary struggles, but they faced social pressure of their own. Nobles were expected to maintain family honor, protect their reputation, and participate in politics. A noble's mistake could become a family problem for generations. Royal families experienced an especially unusual kind of stress. Kings and queens had enormous privileges, but their personal lives were often controlled by duty, their marriages, friendships, and even public appearances carried political meaning. A medieval monarch could not simply make ordinary personal choices. Every decision affected alliances and relationships. A small disagreement inside a royal family could become a serious political issue. Family drama was not just family drama when a crown was involved. The pressure to appear powerful was constant. Kings needed to look confident even during difficult times. Showing weakness could encourage rivals. So, rulers often performed strength, even when they privately dealt with fear and uncertainty. The medieval world was full of people carrying invisible burdens. Farmers worried about harvests, merchants worried about trade, nobles worried about reputation, and rulers worried about power. Everyone had different problems, but almost nobody lived without pressure. Medieval kings and queens are often imagined living in endless luxury, surrounded by gold, servants, and grand celebrations. While they certainly had privileges, royal life came with its own collection of problems. A crown looked impressive, but it was also a very heavy responsibility. A medieval ruler was expected to be almost superhuman. They needed to appear wise, brave, religious, and capable at all times. Showing too much emotion or uncertainty could damage their image. Basically, even kings had to maintain a carefully managed public personality. Royal childhood was rarely simple. Young princes and princesses were prepared for future duties from an early age. They learned manners, politics, religion, and sometimes military skills. Their lives were planned around expectations rather than personal interests. Many royal children were sent away from their families for education. This was normal among noble families, but it meant children often grew up separated from their parents. A palace could be filled with people, yet still feel strangely lonely. Marriage created another major source of royal stress. Kings and queens were often married for political reasons rather than personal happiness. A royal wedding was usually a treaty with fancy clothing and expensive food added to make the arrangement look romantic. Queens especially faced enormous pressure to produce heirs. Their value was often connected to their ability to continue the dynasty. Pregnancy and childbirth were not private family matters. They were matters of national importance. If a queen failed to provide a surviving heir, the consequences could be serious. The royal family might face uncertainty about succession. Suddenly, a personal tragedy became a political problem, discussed by nobles across the kingdom. Kings also worried constantly about succession. A ruler needed a clear line of inheritance to prevent disputes. Medieval history contains many examples where questions about who should rule created years of tension. Let's quietly move toward the strange world of medieval royal habits. Wealthy nobles developed unusual routines that showed their status. Some collected rare objects, some built impressive homes, and others spent enormous amounts proving they were important. Food was one of the easiest ways for nobles to display wealth. Royal meals could include many courses, expensive spices, and unusual ingredients. A feast was not only about eating, it was a performance designed to impress guests. Of course, having a huge feast did not mean life was comfortable all the time. A medieval castle could still be cold, noisy, and inconvenient. Even surrounded by luxury, people still dealt with problems like illness, discomfort, and boredom. Entertainment helped nobles escape their stressful routines. Hunting, music, tournaments, and celebrations filled their schedules. These activities were enjoyable, but they also served political purposes by strengthening relationships between powerful families. Knights and nobles were expected to maintain a certain image of honor and courage. The reality was more complicated. Behind the stories of bravery were ordinary people dealing with financial problems, family conflicts, and personal ambitions. Medieval society valued reputation almost as much as wealth. A person's honor affected their opportunities and relationships. Rumors could damage someone's position, especially among elites, where everyone was watching everyone else. This obsession with reputation created a world where appearances mattered greatly. A noble family might hide financial problems to maintain an image of success. A ruler might hide personal struggles to appear strong. Religion provided another important part of medieval life. Many people found comfort in religious traditions and communities. Churches offered structure, celebrations, and explanations for difficult events that people did not fully understand. However, religious expectations also influenced behavior. People were expected to follow certain moral standards and social rules. The medieval world was deeply connected to religious ideas about duty, responsibility, and the meaning of life. Even time itself felt different in medieval society. Without modern technology controlling schedules, daily life followed natural rhythms. The sun, seasons, and religious calendars shaped how people organized their days. Nighttime brought another set of challenges. Lighting was limited, and darkness changed how people moved and worked. Candles and lamps existed, but they were valuable resources that needed careful use. For most medieval people, comfort was something rare and appreciated. A warm room, a good meal, healthy family members, and a successful harvest were meaningful achievements. Small victories mattered because life demanded constant effort. The medieval world was stressful because uncertainty existed everywhere. People could not easily predict weather, health, politics, or economic conditions. They lived in a world where preparation mattered, but luck often played the final role. Medieval life was stressful because almost every part of existence depended on things people could not fully control. Weather, illness, harvests, politics, and social expectations shaped daily life. People learned to adapt because uncertainty was not an occasional problem, it was simply part of being alive. For farmers, survival depended on the land. A successful harvest meant security, while a poor one created fear about the future. Their lives followed the seasons, and every year brought the same quiet question: would nature cooperate this time? For nobles and royals, stress came from a different direction. They had wealth and comfort, but they carried the heavy burden of reputation, inheritance, and power. A crown could provide luxury, but it also came with endless responsibility. The medieval world was not only a place of hardship. People still celebrated festivals, enjoyed friendships, created art, shared stories, and found moments of happiness, even in difficult times. Humans always searched for comfort and connection. The biggest difference between medieval life and modern life was not that people had no joy. It was that everyday survival required much more effort. Simple tasks like getting food, staying warm, and treating illness demanded patience and constant work. Castles, Villages and medieval towns were filled with people trying their best with the knowledge and resources they had. They were not simply victims of their world. They were skilled survivors who understood how to live within difficult conditions. The struggles of medieval people also remind us how much modern life has changed. Heating, medicine, transportation, communication, and technology have removed many problems that once created daily stress. Things we consider normal today would have seemed almost magical centuries ago. Yet, the medieval desire for a better life feels very familiar. People wanted safety, love, respect, and a little peace after a long day. Whether living in a small village or a royal palace, everyone searched for moments of comfort. So, when we imagine the Middle Ages, we should not only see dark castles and difficult conditions, we should also see ordinary people waking up every morning, working, laughing, building families, and continuing forward despite uncertainty. And perhaps that is the most human part of medieval history. Life was demanding, unpredictable, and often uncomfortable. But people still found reasons to continue. They lived through challenges that feel distant today, leaving behind stories of resilience that survived for hundreds of years. Now, as we leave the crowded villages, cold castles, and endless worries of the medieval world behind, we can return to the comfort of our own time, because after learning how stressful medieval life truly was, a warm room and a quiet night suddenly feel like a very impressive luxury. In ancient Greece, a meal was never just about eating. It was a small social performance where family, tradition, status, and daily life all came together around a table. Of course, not every Greek family was sitting around discussing philosophy while enjoying perfect olive oil and fresh seafood. Real life was much more ordinary. For most ancient Greeks, meals were simple and practical. Bread, olives, vegetables, cheese, and wine formed the foundation of daily food. Meat was not an everyday luxury for many families. It was usually connected to festivals, religious sacrifices, or special occasions. The average Greek household depended heavily on grains. Wheat and barley were essential parts of life. Bread was so important that it was almost the ancient Greek version of a daily necessity. If someone wanted to understand Greek society, they could start by looking at what was sitting on the dinner table. The kitchen itself was usually not the impressive place people imagine. Wealthy homes could have dedicated cooking areas, but many ordinary households used simple spaces with basic equipment. There were no modern appliances, no convenient ovens, and certainly no one complaining that their ancient cooking device needed an upgrade. Family meals were closely connected to the structure of Greek society. The household, known as the oikos, was not just a family home. It was an economic and social unit. It included relatives, servants, and sometimes enslaved people who worked together to maintain the household. The head of the household usually had the most authority in many Greek communities, especially in Athens. The father or senior male controlled important family decisions. Dinner was not simply a relaxing moment. It reflected the hierarchy of the entire household. Women's roles around meals varied depending on the city and social class. In many Athenian households, women were expected to manage domestic responsibilities, including food preparation. They controlled the household space, but had limited public influence compared with men. Food preparation required significant effort. Grinding grain, preparing vegetables, making bread, and storing supplies took time and skill. A modern person might spend 20 minutes making dinner and feel tired. Ancient cooks would probably look at that effort and politely wonder if the person had just finished a vacation. The wealthy had more options. Elite families could afford better ingredients, imported goods, and professional cooks. A rich Greek household might have access to expensive spices, seafood, and fine wines. Food became another way to display status. However, even wealthy Greeks were influenced by ideas about moderation. Ancient Greek culture often praised balance and self-control. Excessive luxury could be criticized, even by people who secretly enjoyed having access to expensive things. This created an interesting contradiction. Greek elites wanted to show wealth, but they also wanted to appear disciplined. They had to demonstrate success without looking like they were trying too hard. Ancient status management was complicated, even without social media. Let's float over to the dining habits of ancient Greek men, because this is where things become especially interesting. In many Greek cities, important social meals happened in the form of the symposium. The symposium was not simply dinner, it was a gathering where men drank wine, discussed ideas, listened to music, and participated in conversation. It was basically a combination of a dinner party, debate club, and social networking event. The word symposium actually means a drinking together. These gatherings were important parts of elite male culture. Guests reclined on couches, while servants brought food and wine. It was comfortable, organized, and carefully designed for conversation. Of course, ancient Greeks had rules about how these gatherings should work. The wine was usually mixed with water, because drinking strong wine straight was considered improper. Greeks believed moderation showed civilization. They had very specific opinions about everything, including how dramatically one should become drunk. Conversation was the true focus of the symposium. Guests discussed politics, philosophy, poetry, and relationships. A clever speaker could gain admiration, while someone behaving foolishly might become the evening's entertainment. Some of history's most famous philosophical discussions were connected with these social gatherings. Thinkers debated ideas about beauty, morality, love, and society. Meanwhile, someone in the background was probably making sure the wine cups stayed filled. However, the symposium was not a complete picture of Greek family life. It mainly represented wealthy male citizens. Many people in ancient Greece, including women, workers, and enslaved individuals, experienced food and social life very differently. Ordinary families did not spend evenings in philosophical conversations. Their meals were focused on practical needs. They needed enough food, enough resources, and enough stability to get through another day. Bread was often the center of the meal. It could be eaten with olives, cheese, onions, vegetables, or simple sauces. These foods might sound basic today, but they provided essential energy for people who worked physically demanding jobs. Olive oil was another major part of Greek life. It was used for cooking, lighting, medicine, and personal care. The olive tree was not just a plant, it was almost a symbol of Greek civilization itself. Fish was especially important in coastal areas. Greece's geography meant many communities had access to seafood. However, fresh fish could be expensive, especially in cities where wealthy citizens competed for high-quality ingredients. Meat was much less common. Animals were valuable because they provided labor, milk, wool, or other resources. A family was not casually turning a useful animal into dinner every week. That would have been a very expensive meal. When meat was eaten, it was often connected with religious ceremonies. Animal sacrifices created communal meals where people shared food together. Religion and eating were deeply connected in ancient Greek society. Family meals across ancient Greece reveal something important about the civilization. Behind the famous temples, philosophers and warriors were ordinary people gathering around simple foods. They worried about supplies, family responsibilities, and daily challenges just like people everywhere. The ancient Greek table was not only a place to eat, it was a place where relationships were built, traditions were passed down, and social rules were quietly reinforced. Whether it was a humble family meal or an elegant symposium, food always carried a deeper meaning. Ancient Greek meals followed many unwritten rules. Eating was not just about satisfying hunger, it was connected to manners, social position, and family traditions. A person's behavior at the table could reveal their education, their background, and whether they understood the expectations of their society. In wealthy households, meals were carefully organized. Servants prepared food, arranged dishes, and helped maintain the smooth rhythm of the gathering. The host's ability to provide a comfortable meal showed generosity and status. Hosting guests was considered important in Greek culture. Hospitality, known as xenia, was a serious social value. A visitor arriving at someone's home was expected to receive food and respect. Turning away a guest without reason was considered a serious failure of proper behavior. Of course, hospitality also came with complications. Welcoming guests could be expensive. A household had to provide food, drinks, and comfort. Being generous was admirable, but it also required resources. Ancient social expectations were not always cheap. Family meals were usually more modest than elite gatherings. A typical household did not have endless courses or luxurious decorations. People ate what was available from their land, local markets, and seasonal supplies. The Mediterranean climate shaped Greek food traditions. Grapes, olives, grains, and vegetables grew well in many regions. These ingredients became central parts of Greek identity. A simple meal could still represent the connection between people and their environment. Bread making was especially important. Women and household workers often spent hours preparing dough and baking. The process required patience and physical effort. There was no pressing a button and waiting for a machine to handle everything, because apparently, ancient kitchens enjoyed making people work for their dinner. Storage was another challenge. Families needed ways to preserve food for periods when fresh supplies were limited. Drying, salting, and storing grains helped households survive difficult seasons. The changing seasons affected family meals. Summer brought certain fruits and vegetables, while winter required preserved foods. Ancient Greeks had to plan ahead because there was no convenient trip to a nearby store whenever something ran out. Let's quietly move toward the children of ancient Greece, because their relationship with food was also interesting. Children were introduced to household traditions from a young age. They learned what foods were valued and how meals reflected family roles. Young children often ate simple foods suited to their age. As they grew older, they gradually joined the routines of adult life. Meals became another way children learned social expectations. Education in Greece was not limited to books and teachers. Family life itself taught important lessons. Children observed how adults behaved, how guests were treated, and how responsibilities were divided. Boys from wealthy families were often prepared for public life. They learned skills connected to citizenship, politics, and social interaction. Meals and gatherings could become training grounds for future participation in society. Girls were usually prepared for household management. In many Greek communities, especially Athens, women were expected to manage domestic responsibilities, food preparation, textile work, and household organization were important skills. However, Greek society was not identical everywhere. Different city-states had different customs. Life in Athens was not the same as life in Sparta, and family traditions could vary greatly depending on location. Spartan families had a particularly unique culture. Sparta emphasized discipline, military training, and simplicity. Their society valued endurance and strength, which influenced their attitudes toward food and luxury. Spartan meals were famous for being simple. The legendary black soup, made with pork, blood, and other ingredients, became associated with Spartan toughness. Outsiders often found it strange, but Spartans considered their lifestyle a reflection of their values. The Spartan approach to food was almost the opposite of luxurious dining. While some Greek elites enjoyed impressive feasts, Spartans believed simplicity created stronger citizens. They were essentially saying, "Comfort makes you soft," which is a very Spartan thing to believe. Athenians, meanwhile, had a stronger connection between food and social conversation. Markets, festivals, and gatherings created spaces where people exchanged ideas while sharing meals. Markets were important parts of Greek cities. Families purchased fresh ingredients, talked with merchants, and learned about available supplies. The marketplace was not just a shopping location, it was a social center. Greek markets could be busy and colorful places. Farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders gathered together. For many people, visiting the market was one of the main ways they connected with the wider community. Food also connected families with religious traditions. Festivals often included special meals and offerings. These events brought communities together and created shared memories. Ancient Greeks understood that eating together created bonds. A shared meal could strengthen friendships, family relationships, and alliances. Food was not only about survival, it was about belonging. The family table was a small reflection of Greek society itself. It showed who had authority, who performed certain roles, and what values were important. Every meal quietly reinforced the structure of the world around them. And as we continue through ancient Greek dining traditions, we begin to see how even ordinary foods carried stories about family, status, religion, and everyday life. The ancient Greek meal was simple on the surface, but underneath it carried centuries of customs and expectations. Ancient Greek meals were much more than simple moments of eating. They were connected to family, tradition, religion, and social identity. A small piece of bread, a bowl of vegetables, or a cup of watered wine could reveal the values and struggles of an entire civilization. The ancient Greek household was built around cooperation. Everyone had a role, from preparing food to managing supplies. Meals reflected these responsibilities. showing how families worked together to survive and maintain their place in society. For wealthy Greeks, dining could become a display of status and influence. Expensive ingredients, large gatherings, and impressive hospitality showed power. A feast was not only about satisfying hunger, it was a carefully arranged performance of wealth and reputation. For ordinary families, meals were simpler but equally meaningful. Food represented stability and survival. A successful harvest, fresh ingredients, and a shared meal after a long day were small comforts in a world where daily life required constant effort. The Greek relationship with food also revealed their connection to nature. Olive trees, vineyards, grains, and the sea shaped their diet and their culture. The landscape around them became part of their identity, appearing in their traditions and everyday routines. Family meals also taught social values. Children learned manners, responsibilities, and cultural expectations by watching adults. The dinner table became an informal classroom where generations passed down traditions without needing books or formal lessons. Even the differences between city-states appeared through food. Athens valued conversation and social gatherings, while Sparta praised simplicity and discipline. The same basic ingredients could represent completely different ideas about life and society. Religion added another layer of meaning to Greek meals. Festivals, sacrifices, and communal gatherings connected food with the gods and the community. Sharing food was often a way of strengthening relationships between people and reinforcing shared beliefs. Looking back at ancient Greek dining, we discover something surprisingly familiar. People thousands of years ago also gathered around food to talk, connect, celebrate, and find comfort after difficult days. The setting was different, but the human experience remained the same. So, when we imagine a family meal in ancient Greece, we should not only picture marble temples and famous philosophers, we should picture ordinary people sitting together, sharing simple food, telling stories, and creating memories. Because across thousands of years, the table has always been one of the places where human life truly happens.